Welcome everyone for the second part of the Spiritism Conference, What If Death is Not the End? Welcome, Dr. Daniel Assisi.
Hi everyone, good to see you again, I hope, at least from my perspective. Thank you again for making your way back into the second part of our two-part conversation around what if death is not the end. We started the first part by mentioning how of an interesting topic this is because it cuts across, I feel, all segments of our world today. All of us, in one way or another, in modern society, are worried about death, or at least we are trying to not deal with it, which also means we're worried about it. Because every time that we try to avoid something, we feel that we don't have enough information, or it's a very daunting topic that we just kind of postpone. So not choosing or not dealing with it is also a choice, and that generally points to the fact that we are ill-equipped to address perhaps one of the most important questions humanity has ever faced, which is what if death is not the end? We know that many different faiths have produced content and information about the afterlife and tell us that life goes on, and that is wonderful if it works for you. But there are some folks who struggle as well in thinking and accepting the idea that life may go on after the physical body perishes, so that our consciousness survives our physical body. And so today what we're trying to do is bring some scientific studies that point us to the idea that our consciousness, or as I prefer to use the term, our spirit, outlives this experience. And so, as you remembered, we talked a little bit in part one of our conversation around the fact that this knowledge could also be very beneficial to those who are struggling with suicidal thoughts, or who have those friends who are struggling with suicidal thoughts. We talked about how that is an epidemic in our times, in modern times, in modern society, and how we hope that the certainty on life after life could help us tackle that problem by giving people some hope and some understanding of what is to come. We spent some time briefly investigating the life and the work of Buddha for a quick second as we take a detour into the Four Noble Truths, which I feel it's an incredible psychological treatise on suffering and pain, when we remembered that pain is generally caused by attachment to impermanent things, which is the impermanence piece that we hear so often in Buddhism, and that I think overlaps very well with Spiritism and with Christianity as well, when we see the lessons of the Christ greatly align with those thoughts as well. Then we jumped a little bit into the fact that there are intellective reasons and emotional reasons for our suffering, and now we started to try to tackle the intellective piece and showing and sharing a little bit of the research that is out there that points us to the idea that there is life after life. And so we started with spontaneous memories and the work of Ian Stevenson and then Dr. Carol Bauman. We jumped into memory regression with the work of Brian Wise and Dr. Michael Newton. And we are going to proceed now with near-death experiences. As we go on through our journey here of visiting 6 different areas that may point us towards the certainty that we may want in regards to the belief in the afterlife. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this journey. And again, I just want to reiterate one more time that we have no desire whatsoever to convince you or to change you in any possible way. All that we are hoping to do is present you with a smorgasbord of information so that you may decide, if you find it interesting, to pursue some of that on your own, because after all, learning is an individual endeavor. We and you and I all have to take responsibility for what we take in and what we accept in our minds. And so what we do is present the information, hopefully make some sort of case that will lead you down a path of finding your own answers to the idea that life goes on, if you feel you can get there. Even if you already accept it, which some people do via faith in general, it's always great to substantiate that faith. In Spiritism, we often talk about reason faith and importance of having rationality and reason aligned with our faith, because only when we do so can we truly have unshakable faith, right? Which can stand the test of time in general. So we do all that to say that we continue with near-death experiences, oftentimes referred to as NDEs, a simple acronym, a term coined by this man over here, Dr. Raymond Moody, who started to see that something interesting was happening. And we'll talk about that. I also want to start by saying that we're also going to talk about Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. And Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross is a Swiss author and a psychiatrist. She's here on the left. Dr. Raymond Moody is on the right. And he's an American author who coined the term near-death experiences. And both of them looked into the experience of clinical death. And what does that mean? Those moments in time when patients actually had the cessation of life take place at the surgical table or at the hospital, and that later came back to life and then tell us about their experiences, which is a really interesting piece, because if you think about it, the moment that what we call physical life stops, there should be no registering of any other experience whatsoever. But nevertheless, almost all the people who experience this kind of experience sometimes recall some specific facts, and there seems to be some commonality amongst them. And you can see that work, not only the work of Dr. Raymond Moody and Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, but other folks as well that talk about this, like Dr. Fenwick in England as well. But anyways, we wanted to expose you to some of that, and it's really a fascinating piece because some of these stories are truly incredible and they are fascinating to read. I'll give you an example of a story that you can read in Dr. Moody's books. Is that one of the patients who had this clinical death experience at the table, at the surgical table, and later came back, recalls actually kind of wandering off the physical body and hearing a conversation that was taking place in a room near the surgical theater. And when he came back into the body, then he remembered that conversation. And that's a fascinating piece, because it's not a conversation that was taking place in the room in which they were trying to bring him to life, but it was in the room adjacent to where he was. How could he possibly have overheard that conversation if he was not present physically in that room? It's a fascinating thing as well. And there are some new modern research I've been told recently, which I thought it was incredible, that some experimenters are actually putting, those fake ceilings that you have, like, where you can pop things up, that they're actually putting pictures on the top of the ceiling so you can't see from the bottom. But if parents experience near-death experiences, they're asking them to tell them if they saw a picture that they could only see from the other side. So fascinating stuff. I don't have results on that, but I thought that was so ingenious in the way that they are trying to further continue the research on this. But what is really interesting about near-death experiences, like I mentioned, is that there seems to be a commonality amongst different people who go through it as to what they perceive. You might have heard the story about the tunnel or the light, and also encountering somebody familiar to them at the end of that experience, or perhaps somebody of great importance in their life, whether it's a religious figure or not, having a conversation. And many of them also narrate that they are given a choice and saying, you have a choice. You can go back or you can come, or sometimes like you don't have a choice, you have to go back. But it's an interesting thing because these experiences seem to be somewhat similar, which is maybe not what you would expect if you were to claim that that was just a byproduct of the brain, right? Of chemistry in the brain, or something. If it really was an illusion or some sort of hallucination, you would imagine that they would be as different as the people who are having them. But they tend to be different, but they tend to follow a little bit of some commonalities in there. But of course, if you're not convinced by that, no matter what I tell you, you might not find that interesting. But if you are open to looking more into this interesting field, you can look at these different books. By Dr. Moody, we have Life After Life, and it's so small here, and Light Beyond as well. And by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which we'll revisit a little bit later when we talk about emotional education. She has an interesting book as well called On Death and Dying and Life Lessons. Those are also readily available, and I think that near-death experiences is a topic that has gone really mainstream. It's relatively easy for you to find information on if you like more information on as well. And it's very fascinating for me as well, because I think that because it deals with medical information, you have very talented and accredited people dealing with it, right? So we're talking about doctors and nurses and who are required to exercise a standard of care and a knowledge and science that is above the average. So it's interesting that the documentation of these things are interesting for that purpose, right? So near-death experiences is another interesting topic that warrants some attention. And here we can also include what we sometimes refer to as OBEs, or out-of-body experiences, and also remote viewing. Some different denominations of people use different names, but the idea of out-of-body experiences is that during concentration or meditation or what have you, some people can and try to detach themselves from their physical body and place their awareness and their consciousness in a different geographical state that their body is not in. And that's what we call out-of-body experience. Sometimes also called remote viewing, because you're trying to view something that's remote from where you are. And here's an interesting fact that's neither here nor there, but nevertheless I think it's interesting because it was done by the government. The government actually tried to carry out some remote viewing experiments in the last century because it thought it potentially could provide insightful warfare information as well. So I don't know the results of those experiences. I only know that they happened. They probably didn't push it forward as much, who knows? But I think that it's interesting that the government was interested in seeing if that was a possibility as well. We put that out there because, talking about so many different things, I probably want to feed your conspiracy theory enthusiasts among us, because it's a long hour that we're going to be together. And if we just talk about plain academic things, you probably might, doze off a little bit. But as I said before, you have to carry your own happiness wagon. So I do that for myself. I thought that was an interesting story. I'll share that with you. That's near-death experiences. So far, so good? Right, so we're going to change gears then and go to instrumental transcommunication, also known as ITC, and sometimes, especially here in the United States, also referred to as EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, right? And this is a simple thing. This is where one places some sort of recording equipment and tries to get voices from them beyond that are not present in the room registered in there, right? And that was done with magnetic tape, which was the old way of doing things. I guess, I don't know if they even have magnetic tape recording nowadays. We're probably dating the researchers here. But it does not require specialized equipment. They just literally just, close a room, put some things in there and kind of record. And this has been popularized in many different ways, in ways that potentially are not so nice to the cause. Like there's like scary movies and all kinds of things that play on that and try to put fear into people about all this stuff, which only really does a disservice, I think, to the whole idea of life after life. But that's a different story. But anyways, this research still takes place. Some people still do it. And I have a picture here of Dr. Constantine Rodiv, which is a Latvian psychologist from the Uppsala University in Sweden. Rodeve, along with Jurgensen, another doctor, they have recorded more than 100,000 EVP sessions. And they study that. And if you are interested in that whole process as well, we can also suggest a book by Tom and Lisa Butler from the American Association for Electronic Voice Phenomena called There Is No Death and There Are No Dead. Powerful title, also true from my perspective. But it's interesting that many different people arrive at this conclusion from many different ways. I think that's one of the fascinating things that I find about this. Also, you might have remembered that in part 1, I mentioned to you that I would tell you which of these areas was least interesting to me. This is it. I think that's interesting. I'm not putting it down. I'm just thinking like, okay, but I think there are other things that are perhaps stronger in many different ways. But that then nevertheless is a very valid field that one should look into. I'm just not as attracted to it. Doesn't find it that interesting for me. But I do think that that's a very valid piece of research that we might want to consider. And if you're interested in pursuing that a little bit further, you have a couple of names there. You have Jurgensen, you have Rodeve, you have Tom and Lisa Butler from the American Association of Electronic Voice Phenomena. You can kind of pursue that on your own. So far, so good? All right. We keep going. I told you there's going to be some information. It might take a little bit of time. Thanks for putting up with us. All right. So here's where it gets interesting, the way, at least for me, right? I want to also talk about mediumship. And we're going to talk about two types of mediumship, or two philosophies of mediumship, because mediumship can also validate the idea that, you know, we can outlive our physical body. Well, the concept is relatively simple. If you are communicating with a spirit of somebody who has lived on Earth before, you are getting direct proof that our consciousness, or our spirit, as I like to call it, outlives this physical body. Right? But there's possible to do that. There has been a lot of research to validate this process through the times, with a high incidence and results of validation in general. And there have been many studies that are constantly redone and as time goes by. One of them, more recently, has been done by Dr. Gary Schwartz, which is this lovely fellow over here. Dr. Gary Schwartz is another big names. Remember, we talked about Dr. Ian Stevens, so hang on with me. He's a director of the Veritas Research Program at the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health at the Department of Psychology at the University of Arizona, right? But again, the interesting piece again, that this is an academic research process funded by a major US university that seeks to understand whether mediumship is a valid way of communication and whether that's successful. The interesting thing about Dr. Gary Schwartz is that he also published a book that's really easy to read for us. So it's not an academic read. It's called The Afterlife Experiments, in which he shares with him his experimentations with many different mediums, including famous mediums like Alison Dubois and John Edward, which you might remember from your TV days. No? John Edward used to have a program on TV that he would do mediumship and kind of messages from the beyond. And Alison Dubois is the medium behind the TV series Medium that was on a couple of years ago about mediums that solves crimes and everything else. Of course, it's TV, so they kind of like take it to the extreme, but she was a consultant there anyways. So they're relatively famous. And what I think it's really interesting about his research in general, and I think I mentioned I had a chance to also to meet him a couple of times in a couple of events, is that it's a really great guy to talk to in general. But what's really interesting is that he really had this mindset of doing almost like the traditional double-blind scientific experiments, right? Where they put mediums behind screens, so they cannot interact with the people that they're technically reading. I know that in the spiritualist tradition, you use the term reading, which I think is a horrible term, but anyways, that's just me. And then the mediums don't really, the clients don't say anything really. They're not allowed to talk at all. It's not to influence it. The medium just kind of gives them, but then they score those readings afterwards. And there's been a high percentage of results and validation from that. So a very interesting thing in general, and it's an easy read, a quick read. It's not a great book, but if you're interested in that kind of research, you might want to read that. Unless you want to go back to the history of mediumship research in general, you could potentially say that if you look at the term mediumship and mediums, those are terms that came about in the 1850s with Allan Kardec, who coined that term. Before the term did not exist, so you're not going to find the term mediumship pre-1850s. But you are going to find, if you think about it, a lot of different mediumship expressions in our history, from prophets, for instance, who talk to spirits, to oracles, and to shamans, and all kinds of things. The concept is the same. The name is different because the word didn't exist there. I do like the name quite a bit, and I like the thinking that Kardec has applied to it, because that's an ability that people have to be an intermediary between two planes of life. So mediumship, the vehicle of being an intermediary. It's not a ship of middle size, not a small ship, not a big ship. It's an intermediary ship. People sometimes ask me on a funny note whether I'm a medium. I am not a medium. I am extra large. Just want to put you at ease. Don't you worry about that. But anyways, as we pull our own happiness wagon here, we should go back and remember that there have been many other interesting scientists who have conducted thorough research on mediumship with interesting results as well. If we go back in time, I know it's kind of hard for you to see there probably, but we have some pictures here. And this is Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes on the left side. We have Cesare Lombroso from Italy, and we have Gabriel Delon, philosopher from France over here. We also have William Crookes, a famous scientist who, if I'm not mistaken, has been awarded the Nobel Prize for chemistry or physics or something incredible like that. Don't quote me. But he was also a member of the Royal Society, which to study things. And to the end of his life, he actually proposed a study to the Royal Society where he said, not only I have done this, I'm convinced. And he did something that was fantastic and really interesting. And this is in this picture over here, which is kind of small too. But you see that picture over there? There is a lady and there is a man kneeling beside her. The man is him, William Crookes, and the lady is actually not a lady. It's the materialization, they call it, of a spirit, of the physical materialization of a spirit through the use of what they call ectoplasm, which is a substance that comes from the medium itself, and it covers the spirit so that the spirit may be physically seen by all that's present. It's very rare, very hard to attain, but nevertheless, I think that picture is interesting because that picture is from the 1800s, right? Or like early 1910s, which is no Photoshop, people. Right? Nowadays, it's very easy for you to be critical about things. Anything I look, right? It can be photoshopped and photo touched or whatever the term is. I just don't know. I just don't know what that is. But back in the day, pictures were a lot more complex, and so editing them is a lot harder. But to have somebody stake their reputation and somebody so recognized as William Crookes and go officially into record with the Royal Society saying that this is a certainty that he has. It's quite fascinating. And we have also here on the right side the Scottish medium Didi Hume, who also was very famous in the 1800s, was also studied by different people, including Crookes, that performed a lot of different phenomena. So if you want to read more about their lives and so forth, they're really interesting. And if you're not tired of those studies yet, I'm going to give you a couple more. Here we have Charles Richet, the famous thinker as well, that has, maybe he was the one who was a Nobel Prize. I think he was a Nobel Prize. I don't think Crookes was. I think I might be making a mistake there. I need to go check my sources. And also here we have on the right side Alexander Aksakov, who also wrote about this. And Richet also studied the medium Eusapia Palladino, who was a very interesting story, by the way, because she would actually charge them to be studied because she wanted to make a living off of this. And there's actually some interesting writings when you look at it. I find it fascinating that the Richet and other people who were studying her were saying that they believe that the the phenomena was true, because at sometimes she would fake it because she wanted to get paid for the research. But she was such a bad faker that they could tell when she was faking and when she was not, right? And so it's a very interesting thing. But I do think that Charles Richet was the recipient of the Nobel Prize. But anyways, it's very interesting because you are going to see those cases in which people try to force a fake mediumistic communication, which is unfortunate, but it's also very true. But nevertheless, because somebody fakes something does not necessarily preclude the entire field from existence, right? Just because you pretend to speak Spanish or French does not mean that other people don't speak French or Spanish, right?
They both received Nobel Prize.
Oh, I'm so glad they did. So I am told that both Crookes and Richet received Nobel Prizes, which make me feel better because I was feeling really bad about not having the right information. So thank you, I appreciate that. Yay for modern technology and the bigger brains than yours who can validate things for us. So thank you very much, friend. I really appreciate it. Our friend Marcia, always very helpful. Thank you. So that is mediumship research from a spiritualist tradition, which is really interesting. And what I find very interesting and curious as well as a spiritist is that there seems to be a slight difference between the mediumistic practices of spiritualists and spiritists. Although they started at the same time, roughly, the new spiritualist movement here in the US and the Spiritist movement in France in the 1850s and 1840s. The spiritualist mediumship practices have tended to focus on the phenomena as a proof of existence of the life after, of the soul after this life. And so did the Spiritist movement early on. But once there was a certain sense of satisfaction with the results, the Spiritist movement moved on from physical phenomena and research into what we call intellectual phenomena, and trying to obtain morally relevant information that would help us become better people and help others. So that's why I put them apart, and I say that the Spiritist mediumship practice is slightly different than the spiritualist one. For instance, you will not find paid Spiritist practice whatsoever. All mediumship practice in Spiritism is free. You will not find readings, for instance, that kind of practice. There will be no prognostication and none of that stuff. We try to focus mediumship into the use of helping others or acquiring information. But anyways, and a lot of the work that is done in mediumship through Spiritism has to do with service to others, and especially service to what we call discarnate beings, beings who have shed their mortal coil, as we talked about before, as using the Shakespearean term, who have left their physical body behind. Oftentimes, we find in Spiritism that many of them struggle with making sense of their new reality, and even don't know that they are past. And so a lot of counseling takes place in Spiritist meetings where help is provided to those who are in that position and who are unaware that they have passed on. But anyways, that perhaps a topic for another time. What's interesting here is a couple of things from the Spiritist tradition. One, the interesting piece is that this search and this method, the Spiritist method for mediumship, really started with a scientific mindset of we need to validate that information that's coming in a scientific way. And the way we validate that information that's coming in a scientific way is by looking for that replication. So Kardec, when he first started to study these phenomena, which took place in France in the 1850s, called the turning tables, where tables were starting to move by themselves, and he just didn't believe that was happening because tables have no central nervous system. How can it possibly feel? But then he went to different places and the result was replicating itself. And then mediums eventually came to be. He coined the term. And what he would do is he'll put his Sherlock Holmes cap on, and he'll go to one meeting, a mediumship meeting, and ask a question, and then go to another one across town that people did not know each other and ask the same question again. and then also had people from different countries submit their answers to the questions. And then he would check to see all those questions to see if they had commonality. And the ones that did made their way into the Spirits book, which is this primary book, or Spiritism here, which you can find. Also, not a very exciting read, to be honest with you. I mean, it's very great in many different ways, but it's not one of those books that you pick up and say, yay, I'm going to read this 1,000 questions in one day, right? Sure. Look that you love it, but I'm saying, like, in general, like, I haven't met a person yet that says, you know what, I'm not going to go to the movies with you on Friday night because I'm going to read 400 questions. And I also don't think that you should read it all at once, because it's in a question of format, and a question and answers format, so that you can see what question was posed and the answer that was given verbatim, and then you can kind of figure it out for yourself and make a decision whether you like it or not. So Kardec decided to keep the actual primary source so that you can skip the process of having somebody editorialize for you. But I say that because what I really want to get at is book 2. And that's called, The Medium's Book, in which he started to study the phenomena of mediumship and the mechanics of it as well, so that people could practice in a safe way. It was the first and the most comprehensive treatise on mediumship ever written from a scientific perspective. And to this day, it remains as the book in the field. It's a fascinating book. But why do I say that? All that build up to say that mediumship from a Spiritist perspective is a really interesting piece, because it's replicating by thousands of groups, of Spiritist groups, every single day throughout the world. So we have this frequency of phenomena taking place, and in this phenomena, we have a series of consciousness communicating who are very different from the medium giving that communication. And so if you have been in those meetings constantly, you will see that you get a variety of different personalities that becomes really hard for you to actually fake. Because how do you come up with all those different stories about people's lives? It's a fascinating process. And so if that is something that you're interested, you can read more about that in the Spiritist works. You can talk perhaps to people who participate in such meetings in general, such as myself. But it's another area in which might be interesting for us to put our thought process into. With me so far? All right, so we visited 6 different areas, right? Spontaneous memories, memory regression. We visited also instrumental transcommunication. Say that fast 3 times, always gets me, right? We also did near-death experiences, and we did 2 types of mediumship approach. And those are different pieces that we wanted to offer to you as opportunities for further studies if you so choose. It's up to you. You don't have to entertain one or any of those in general, right? And I want to do a little bit of a thought process here with you. These are not scientific evidence at all, but it's philosophical in a different way. So these are interesting points that also point to the existence of life after life. If you believe in the existence of God. If you don't believe in the existence of God, those are probably not going to hold for you. But if you do, then you might want to ask yourselves, like reincarnation, for instance, the fact that the conscious outlives the physical body and returns explains, congenital disorders, varying levels of natural abilities that people have. How come some people, 5-year-olds, seem to already have played the piano for years, but they haven't, right? We all see those little geniuses that come up, and I couldn't play like 2 keys in the piano, for 20 years of practice if I practice, which I totally don't. In my defense, I don't practice the piano. But you see what I'm saying? So reincarnation explains, philosophically speaking, that they have already obtained that knowledge in previous lives, and that's why you have people who have such an ease, because otherwise we would struggle with the problem of fairness, divinely speaking. How is it fair that some people are born with so many different gifts that we call gifts, or just really abilities acquired in a previous life, if they don't have a previous life? Where is the justice in that? Where is the justice in having the chance of being born in a healthy and wealthy family versus a broken family, or even having perhaps some physical challenges, right? It becomes very difficult for us to believe in a God that gives us different starting points and judges for eternity on all of these things. And a lot of people I've talked to have struggled with this. They believe in God, but have trouble reconciling. But if you put reincarnation into the mix, it becomes a lot easier for you to understand why the world is the way it is. But that's a topic for another time. I want to just put that in there as a thought process in general. It's not scientific per se, but it's there, right? Woo! All right, we're racing through this. Who's tired? I am. All right. So we talked a little bit about the intellectual piece, right? But what's really interesting here is, what if we accept that there is life after death, right? We still have to deal with the challenges of everyday life, and we still also have to train our emotional side. And I ask ourselves, our society has placed quite a bit of emphasis on intellectual training and intellectual education. But where is our emotional education? How do we learn how to deal with our conflicts, with our challenges, with our pains, with our suffering, with our perceptions that sometimes we know are not warranted? Sometimes we know intellectually that we shouldn't feel that certain way, but we cannot help it and we don't know how to deal with that, right? We cannot blame our parents because they have not really received that from their parents either. I know it's really easy and convenient to blame our parents, but if you think about it, they have received less emotional training than we have, right? So we are not accustomed to talking about our feelings. We're not accustomed to dealing with our conflicts. We don't know how to deal with all that, and that kind of bottles up. And I wonder if that contributes to our current challenges as it relates to suicide and overall maladjustness in society. We don't know how to deal. We don't know how to seek help or how to handle that. And hopefully that will change, and I think it will, because we are seeing that the young ones, the kids in school, are beginning to learn and more about social emotional learning and knowing how to deal with their feelings and everything else. But I bring that because it's important for our day and time to understand how to deal with all of this. And I bring back again Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who has a wonderful quote that I want to share with you. You might be familiar, but I think it says everything. It basically says, I'm not okay, you're not okay, and that's okay. Right? We all have challenges, like we all are struggling with something, but we all have this sense that everybody else has got it figured out. If you've been on social media, you have seen it. People sometimes only post about the greatest and most wonderful thing that's happening in their lives. They always manage to post their plane tickets when they're going to Paris, right? Nobody posts their Greyhound bus to somewhere else, right? Right, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, nobody posts like their stuff, or it's all PD call, right? Like, we don't know how to deal with our feelings, and I'm not putting social media down. I think it's a wonderful tool for us to connect with people, but it's how we use it. And I think it's a reflection of how we feel and what we want to do. We are all putting this mask on that we are wonderful people because we are afraid of sharing of our vulnerability with others, because we think somehow that's going to make us less than who we are. Because we think that everybody's got it figured out. But the truth is that only hurts us in the long term, and because mental health has been quite taboo. The idea of getting counseling or talking about our feelings has been extremely hard for generations before us. Only crazy people did that, right? According to grandparents and so forth. We shy away from that, and we know that's not the case. I mean, we have coaches for math, right? We have tutors for science in school. Why couldn't we get tutors and coaches for us to deal with our challenges in processing our information? So it's very important for us to break that stigma and understand that whether you believe in life after life or not, it will be very helpful for us to work through our emotional challenges while we're still here, right? So that we can have happier and more fulfilling lives. And so in a way, it's sort of like going to the gym, and I hope that we would do that we would come to terms with the idea that these are things that happen to all of us, that we have challenges, that we struggle, and by doing that, we'll be more open to to understanding our feelings and communicating about that. Because sometimes we even struggle about understanding our feelings. We don't even know what feelings are out there. If you can't name your feeling, we're in trouble. You can't address it, right? So these are not necessarily Spiritist tools, but I wanted to offer them as reference points if you're interested in searching more about that. This is a slide that made its way in there because a lot of people had asked about this in previous presentations, but I wanted to share with you, oops, let me see here. There is wrong screen. ruler framework. This is from Mark Brackett from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, who I had a chance of meeting at a conference. 2 conferences actually, very interesting. And he uses the ruler framework for understanding feelings. The R is for recognizing emotions in self and in others. Are we able to do that? The U is for understanding the cause and consequences of emotions. The L is labeling emotions accurately, and the E is expressing emotions appropriately, and R is regulating emotions effectively. So can you recognize what emotion you have? And that's actually surprising, because if you think about it, I have done this in like longer workshops, and I ask people to list all the emotions they can think of. And oftentimes people struggle. Their list is not very big. It's like 4 or 5 emotions, but there's hundreds of different emotions. But if we don't know, if we don't in touch with them, we don't really understand what's happening with us. And if we don't understand what we're feeling, it becomes difficult for us to address it, right? And the way that it generally manifests is in some sort of blow up eventually. Or you can do what most humans do, which is, take it all out in their families, right? Those who are close to you. And that becomes an interesting perspective as well, and very different. And then the other side, I also want to mention Marshall Rosenberg from the Center for Nonviolent Communication. Marshall Rosenberg has passed on. This is sometimes referred to as compassionate communication, but he coined the term and the method of nonviolent communication. And the NVC model is a really interesting one. It's a model of how to communicate with others when you're having conflict. Because we also have an aversion to conflict. We think conflict is something bad, right? But conflict, all conflict is that people have different needs and they're not able to figure it out. So because every behavior is a result of a need, we have to kind of figure that stuff out. And so the way that he proposes you do that, and you can read more in his book called Nonviolent Communication, is that you start with an observation, you state your feelings about it, you ask for your needs, you recognize your needs, and you make a request. We all might have been through this when you get a call from somebody and they say, "Why are you there? Why are you not home?" Or "Where have you? Why are you hanging out with your friends?" Or "Weren't you supposed to do this?" It's all passive aggressiveness that comes from something else. But if you're able to break it down in ways that make sense, you can say, "Hey, I have observed that on Wednesday you weren't home because you were doing this," right? That made me feel this way. And because I really like to spend time with you, because I have a need, I'd like to be close to you, I'd like to make a request on whether next Wednesday you could not do that and instead spend time with me. As opposed to, "Where were you Wednesday?" Right? Which is a veiled a request for help. But anyways, these are interesting tools that one can tackle and look into if you are wondering and willing to try to hone in your interpersonal communication skills, which is something that we have not been taught at school, like I was saying before, right? But okay, so that's some of our emotional solutions there. And then you might ask, that's, wonderful, Dan, but how can Spiritism help us with all of this? How can Spiritism add to the mix? And I think it can, for some of the reasons that we kind of touched on. But if we look back on the idea that Spiritism, it's actually a dynamic body of knowledge. It's a scientific endeavor that continues to grow as more research is done. And because it studies the nature, origin, destiny of spirits, because Spiritists are concerned with studying what is the spirit and what does it come from, and how does it work, and where is it going? And by spirits, we mean us. And how it relates to the physical world, I think Spiritism has a very big role to play if we let it in our lives, because it starts to bring all this wonderful information together that's acquired through the good spirits, but also through our own observation, and points us towards that inner transformation that we've been talking about, right? The fact that we may not be able to convince other people or work on other people, but we can work on ourselves. And if we are better equipped to deal with our own conflicts and own challenges, not only will we make our lives better, we also make the lives of others better. And if you have a partner, they're probably going to nod, yes, right? They're probably saying, "Figure your stuff out, because then my life will be better," all right? And we have this tendency we have this tendency to want change, but we don't want to change. We want everybody else to do things differently, right? And we were just talking about it the other day and saying, there's 7 billion people on Earth. You're basically saying, hey, 6,999,000,000 people, do stuff the way I want to, right? And that doesn't work because the other 6,999,000,000 are saying the same thing, and hence we find ourselves in the same spot. But if we focus on changing our own actions for the better, no matter our belief system, because you don't have to believe in anything to be a good person. You can just be one. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who has been he's an incredible human being, and he doesn't believe in any kind of religion because he was really hurt by organized religion early on, but he's the most, I feel like, the best soul I know, and he doesn't believe in God, but he's the very definition of the kind and good person. So labels don't really matter. I joked around, and I was just talking about before, we all work for the same boss. It's just different departments, right? So let's stop the fuss about the marketing department is complaining about the business department with the sales department. It's all the same boss, right? Who cares, right? The label does not matter. What matters is that we put into practice what we learn to make ourselves better people and go back to the idea of detaching ourselves from impermanent things, focusing on things that will last so that we can be happier and as we go. And if we do that, then when we revisit those causes, we have a wonderful quote here from the Spirits book from question 917 offered by the Spirits. And when they say, when it's rightly understood, education will be the key to moral progress. Education will be the key to moral progress, not intellectual progress. So we're talking about emotional education. And Kardec also goes on and says, when the art of managing characters is as well understood as the art of managing intelligences, we will be able to correct characters in the same way that we strengthen new plants. That we should and ought to be paying attention to emotional and character building as opposed to putting just an emphasis on intellectual development. Because when we do that, we can correct our shortcomings in such a way as that allow us to be happier in the shorter term and not have to struggle with challenges in the next life or even the in-between lives. As we oftentimes find in our Spiritist meetings where we are talking with people who have regretted their actions in this life, and now that they have passed, they are at odds of wanting to make amends and don't know how to do that, right? So it's a really interesting piece in general. So as we bring the immortality of the soul and we begin to understand that we are immortal spirits that outlive this physical body, then a great sense of peace and comfort should perhaps come to us, because we know that we are never going to cease to be. We may cease to be in this shape, but just like a liquid that you put into another bottle, the liquid and the essence will still be there no matter the shape that you're in. Personally, I'm looking to be in better shape next time, but it doesn't preclude me from working on the shape. I could technically say that I'm in shape because round is a shape, right? But all jokes aside, I mean, it's really important for us to understand that who we are, what we are, is not what we see. And those around us are also not that. So we also have to be tolerant with them. And when that kicks in, when we understand the spiritual world and we start to focus more into ourselves, the world changes. It really changes. The things that we look at start to transform themselves, and the challenges that we face become different. They're not unsurmountable. They're opportunities for growth. Because if we believe in a creator, for instance, as I do personally, then I know that God will never give me a burden that is greater than my ability to overcome it. Then, so why is it for? Is it for learning? Then what is it that I can learn from this opportunity? How will this help me? And I think that transforms the challenges that we see. It may not help us find the easy solutions we're seeking for, but it might help us find lasting solutions that will give us closer to the idea of detaching from the impermanent and putting treasures in heaven, right? Or in the virtuous things that we should pay attention to as well. And that transforms everything. It makes us see the world in a different way. And if I may, I also want to do that a little bit with you and invite us to, now that we've gathered some of the knowledge, to revisit some of our old knowledge that has been sitting there and that sometimes it just sticks with us because we haven't really questioned it. And I do that by bringing this picture up. And this is a wonderful picture of Jesus, the Christ, painted by the painter Acciani, which was, I think, 11 or 12. And I bring that because it's a different picture than what you're used to. And I do that on purpose. Because a lot of us who are Christian have this picture of Christ as a blonde and blue-eyed, which may not be accurate, given the time and place in which he lived. But the physical piece does not matter anyway. So I put this here to say, can we think about things differently? Can we reevaluate his message? Because I find that his message was one of outliving his physical body, right? If you want to boil down, the great thing that Christ did in his entire life was he came back from the dead to tell us that we can do the same thing as well, that we are not going to die forever, that we are going to continue after the fact. And that is a wonderful message of love and hope. And I don't know why we keep focusing on all the pain and suffering that he went to. He didn't come to teach us pain and suffering. He came to teach us happiness. The word gospel means good news, right? Pain and suffering, not good news, people. Yeah. Right? I don't know about you, but I didn't come here to suffer. I came here to learn to be happy, right? And that's how I face my life every day. But I want to bring a wonderful story. You know the story of Lazarus. And then when Lazarus dies, technically, right? And they send, Martha and Mary send for Jesus. And Jesus says, I'll be there in a cool minute, which must have drove them nuts, right? Because it takes them like a day and a half or two to get there, right? And then when he gets there, Martha, who is very straightforward, and I love Martha in many different ways. I even do a talk about Martha and Mary because I love that. I think Martha is really misunderstood. She's very straightforward. She's a strong woman, which I love. And she says, Jesus, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection in the last day. And Jesus goes, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? So if I were to read this with new eyes, I would say that what the Christ is saying is that the teachings of life eternal and spirituality are the resurrection and the life. That he has come to personify those. He's not speaking for himself. He's speaking for God. He's speaking for everything that stands right. So it seems cocky because we are used to trying to impress others, but he was not. He just was. He had no ego in him. We do, right? And when you can back it up, it's not being cocky, right? If I say I'm going to shoot a three-pointer 5 times and I do it, I wasn't cocky. That was a reality, right? It may sound like it because we're used to saying that, but so he's the personification of that. He's saying, with all these spiritual teachings that we have, when we acquire the certainty that there is life after life, those who believe in all this will live, even though they die, because there is no death. You continue to living spiritually, even though your physical body dies. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And the opposite is also true. If you get this now, then when your physical death comes, you just continue to be, your transition will be easier because you understand that God has seen fit that you never stop being. That's wonderful. And then he does the wonderful educator thing and he says, do you believe in this? Mm-hmm. So in many different ways, right, to make sure that we're learning. So in many different ways, the story of Lazarus is our story. It's us symbolically coming back from the dead. That is to say, us learning about spirituality and awakening to this new reality, knowing that we will never die. That we rest assured that whatever it is that we do, the love of God will be with us and will give us different ways through reincarnation to make up for the bad consequences that we have created through our own actions, or to enjoy the good consequences that we have made also through our own actions. Because a loving God, the God that I see ruling this incredible universe, would always give an opportunity for us to learn, much the same way Jesus, his divine messenger, always did. And I start to think about death in general and say, how wonderful it would be if we had that certainty in our hearts, all of us on this planet, that we are not going away. We would perhaps feel more empowered to solve our problems now, ask for help now, and understand that all the problems that come our way are just a phase of learning in our lives. Yes, some problems seem really big, but you're also not alone. God is with us. All these wonderful messengers are with us. And if you really let this thing take hold in your heart, if there's space in your heart for these messages of love and life eternal and reincarnation, then it can also start to come to you that you have had many other acquaintances from previous lives that also loved. And you know, love never ends. When somebody you love passes, you don't stop loving them. Do you think they would stop loving you? No. So the love that you build here goes with you forever. And that means that there's such an amount of love from people that you don't remember, but that love you, coming your way right now. There is never a reason for us to feel down, but we still do because we're human, and that's okay. That's when we use our brains to remember and kickstart our heart again and know that we are never alone. And we hope that along with that certainty that fills our heart, our minds can also entertain that there's physical proof to all of this. This is not an either-or proposition. You don't have to believe or know. Both of them are possible. And science more and more is advancing to that. More and more science is talking about energies. And more science will prove materialism wrong, because now they're really talking about energies in the most quantic level. But that's a conversation for another time. For now, we hope that you stay with peace, love, and mercy in your heart, and continue to know that you're extremely loved, that God loves you in many different ways that you cannot possibly imagine, and that forever you will be able to live and grow your love with people around you. So thank you for your time, and we wish you a great day. All right?